In the spring of 1970, a car appeared on the Formula One grid that looked like nothing anyone had ever seen before. It was jet black, wedge-shaped, with radiators mounted on its sides instead of the front, and aerodynamic elements sculpted with a precision that seemed almost alien for the era. This was the Lotus Type 72, and within weeks of its debut, it would redefine what a racing car could be. The Lotus 72 didn't just win races, it won a championship. It didn't just succeed for a season, it dominated for 6 years. It didn't just influence future designs, it became the template that, more than 50 years later, every single Formula One car on the grid is still based upon. This is the story of how one revolutionary machine changed motorsport forever and the brilliant minds who dared to imagine it. To truly understand the revolutionary nature of the Lotus 72, we must first step back to the world it emerged into. Throughout the 1960s, Formula One cars were beautiful in their simplicity. Long, slender machines that resembled cigars more than anything else. These cars were designed around one fundamental principle: reduce air resistance. The engines were positioned longitudinally, the radiators sat in the nose, and the overall shape was intentionally narrow and streamlined. Designers believed that the way to go faster was to slip through the air like a knife through silk. Engineers built heavier, more powerful engines and relied on mechanical grip and driver skill to control the machine. Power was everything. Weight was accepted as inevitable. And aerodynamics? Well, aerodynamics meant drag, and drag meant speed loss on the straights, something no team wanted to sacrifice. By the late 1960s, however, this philosophy was beginning to crack. Ferrari and Brabham had started experimenting with wings, inverted aerofoils mounted on struts that generated downforce, pressing the car harder to the track. These early attempts were crude and sometimes dangerous, but they worked. They made cars faster through corners. Lotus, under the visionary Colin Chapman, picked up this theme and ran with it, attaching elaborate wing structures to their cars. But these were afterthoughts, bolted onto designs that had been conceived without them in mind. What Formula One needed wasn't modification. It needed a complete reimagining. And that reimagining was coming. Colin Chapman was not like other team principals. While others were content to tweak and refine existing designs, Chapman viewed Formula One as a blank canvas upon which he could paint his engineering philosophy. His mantra was simple, elegant, and devastating in its implications. Adding power makes you faster on the straights. Subtracting weight makes you faster everywhere. From this principle flowed a cascade of innovations. Chapman understood that a racing car's essence lay not in its power plant, but in its balance, its responsiveness, its purity of purpose. He was obsessed with making Lotus cars lighter and more efficient than their rivals, and he wasn't afraid to break convention to achieve it. Alongside Chapman stood Maurice Philippe, an aerospace engineer whose background in aircraft design would prove instrumental to the Lotus 72's conception. Philippe had worked with Chapman on several groundbreaking projects, including the Lotus 49, which had revolutionized single-seater racing by using the engine as a stressed structural member. This innovation, making the engine itself part of the chassis rather than simply bolting it into a separate frame, became the foundation upon which the Lotus 72 would be built. Philippe brought a mechanical clarity and innovative thinking to every challenge. While Chapman provided the conceptual direction and pushing vision, Philippe translated that vision into engineering reality. Together, these two men would create something that transcended motorsport and entered the realm of industrial design legend. The Lotus 72 represented a fundamental shift in how racing cars could be designed. The wedge shape was the most obvious innovation, but it was far from the only one. This shape was inspired by the Lotus 56 gas turbine car, which had been an experimental project years earlier. By adopting the wedge, Chapman and Philippe accomplished several objectives simultaneously. First, it lowered the car's center of gravity by pushing the engine down and back. Second, it created a more efficient aerodynamic profile. Third, and most crucially, it freed up the front of the car for a completely new approach to cooling. The most radical decision was moving the radiators from the front of the car to the sides. Rather than a single large radiator mounted in the nose, the Lotus 72 featured two smaller radiators positioned on either side of the monocoque chassis, just behind the front wheels. This wasn't merely an aesthetic choice, it was a revolution in thermal engineering. By moving the radiators to the side pods, Chapman and Philippe could design a flat, pointed front end that cut through the air more efficiently. This single change had cascading benefits: improved aerodynamics, better weight distribution with the cooling system moved rearward, and a lower, more compact design overall. In back-to-back testing with the Lotus 49, the new 72 was approximately 12 miles per hour faster in a straight line with the exact same engine. The braking system underwent an equally dramatic transformation. The Lotus 72 moved all 4 brake discs inboard, mounting them on the chassis rather than at the wheels. This reduction in unsprung weight, the mass that isn't supported by the suspension, had profound effects on handling and responsiveness. Unsprung weight had traditionally been overlooked by designers, but Chapman recognized that every kilogram saved from the wheels and suspension would translate directly to better acceleration, braking, and cornering performance. The front brakes were connected to the wheels via hollow brake shafts, a technically elegant solution that added another layer of sophistication to the design. The suspension itself was equally innovative. Rather than the coil springs that had become standard, the Lotus 72 employed torsion bar suspension with progressive rates. The front suspension featured anti-dive geometry, designed to prevent the car's nose from dipping dramatically during hard braking, a notorious weakness of the Lotus 49. The rear suspension incorporated anti-squat geometry, which prevented the car's tail from rising under acceleration. Theoretically, this should have kept the car's ground clearance and aerodynamic characteristics consistent regardless of whether it was braking or accelerating, and regardless of fuel load. Aerodynamics weren't limited to the wedge shape. The Lotus 72 featured the largest rear wing yet seen on a Formula One car, with multiple adjustable elements. These wings weren't the delicate struts of earlier designs, but substantial structures that generated serious downforce. There were also small wings at the front, contributing to overall aerodynamic efficiency. All of these elements worked in concert to create an integrated aerodynamic package, something relatively novel for 1970. And then, at the British Grand Prix in 1970, came another masterstroke. Chapman unveiled a revolutionary air intake mounted on top of the car, above the driver's head. This airbox was aerodynamically shaped to increase the pressure of air entering the engine, effectively ramming more oxygen-rich air into the Cosworth DFV engine. This single innovation produced tangible power gains, pushing the engine's output toward 420 horsepower. The Cosworth DFV itself was a marvel, a compact, powerful 90-degree V8 that had been used in the Lotus 49 and had proven extraordinarily durable and reliable. Now, with the airbox feeding it higher pressure air, the DFV was reaching new levels of performance. The Lotus 72 made its racing debut at the Spanish Grand Prix on April 19, 1970, driven by Jochen Rindt and the young John Miles. Expectations were incredibly high. This was a car unlike anything else on the grid, and everyone in the paddock knew it was special. Yet the reality of that first outing was crushingly disappointing. The car suffered from handling problems that no one had anticipated. Rindt's car experienced a broken semi-axle during the very first practice session, and in the race itself, he retired after just 9 laps. Miles also had a miserable outing, finishing well down the field. The problem became apparent quickly. The anti-dive and anti-squat geometries, which theoretically should have improved handling, were causing the opposite effect in practice. The anti-dive system was so aggressive that it caused instantaneous brake locking. The anti-squat system created terrible traction issues due to rear suspension jacking effects. Additionally, the inboard brakes were mounted so close to the massive aerodynamic elements that heat became a catastrophic problem. The Paxilin spacers that Lotus had installed to protect the CV joints from brake heat were simply melting, causing further mechanical failures. The car that was supposed to revolutionize Formula One was, in its initial form, barely functional. 1 week later, at the BRDC International Trophy at Silverstone, the Lotus 72 made another appearance, and the results were similarly poor. By now, it was clear that something fundamental had to change. Rather than abandon the concept, however, Lotus took the revolutionary step of thoroughly reworking the car back at the factory. They removed the anti-dive and anti-squat geometries entirely from Rindt's car, a radical simplification that went directly against the sophisticated engineering philosophy that had animated the original design. Sometimes, in racing, less is more. Rindt's car lost both systems. Miles's car was less extensively modified, retaining only the removal of anti-squat geometry. Within weeks, everything changed. The car was unleashed at the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort on June 21, 1970, and Rindt demonstrated what the 72 was truly capable of. He qualified on pole position, nearly a quarter of a second ahead of his closest competitor, an enormous margin in that era. In the race, he went on to take a commanding victory, proof positive that the modifications had unlocked the car's potential. What followed was a demonstration of engineering dominance rarely seen in motorsport. Rindt won the next 3 races as well, at Belgium, France, and Britain. 4 consecutive victories established him as the clear championship favorite. The car that had been a joke just weeks earlier had become unstoppable. Jochen Rindt was one of the most brilliant drivers of his era. Austrian-born but racing under the Austrian flag, he combined fearless aggression with meticulous precision. In 1970, driving the Lotus 72, he seemed almost untouchable. By mid-season, he had built a commanding lead in the championship. But Formula One in 1970 was a dangerous sport, far more dangerous than it would become after the safety reforms that followed Rindt's own tragedy. At the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, one of the fastest circuits on the calendar, teams made a critical decision. They would remove the rear wings from their cars to reduce drag and increase top speed. The powerful Ferrari flat 12s had been significantly faster than the Lotus on the straights, so reducing drag seemed essential. Rindt decided to attempt practice runs without wings on Saturday, September 5, 1970. In an effort to maximize the car's top speed, higher gear ratios were fitted, potentially pushing the car toward 205 miles per hour or higher. During his 5th practice lap, Rindt braked for the famous Parabolica corner, and something went catastrophically wrong. The car snapped to the left, whether due to instability from running without wings, a failure of the front brake shaft, or both, was never conclusively determined. The Lotus hit a poorly installed safety barrier, and the car was demolished. Rindt, who refused to wear crutch straps as part of his harness configuration, submarined in the cockpit, his body moving downward rather than being held in place. His throat was fatally slit by the seat harness buckle. He was pronounced dead en route to the hospital in Milan. The paddock reeled from the loss. Rindt had been more than a brilliant driver. He had been a popular figure, charismatic and kind. Fellow drivers mourned him genuinely. Team Lotus, devastated, withdrew all their cars from the race. There would be no quick substitution, no moving forward as if nothing had happened. In the wake of tragedy, questions arose about whether the race should proceed at all. But the 1970 Italian Grand Prix did go forward, with Clay Regazzoni scoring the victory in a subdued, muted atmosphere. What happened next was extraordinary. Rindt's teammate, a young Brazilian named Emerson Fittipaldi, who had joined the team earlier in the season, drove with inspired determination through the final races of 1970. Fittipaldi scored enough points to secure the championship, enough points to ensure that Jochen Rindt, though gone, had won the Drivers' Championship posthumously. He remains the only driver in Formula One history to achieve this grim distinction. The Lotus 72, despite the tragedy, had proven its worth beyond any doubt. It had earned a championship, and though it had cost one of motorsport's brightest talents, it had also created a legacy that would endure for decades. Emerson Fittipaldi was only 25 years old when he won the World Championship in 1972. He remains the youngest driver ever to achieve this distinction. a record that stood for over 3 decades until Fernando Alonso eclipsed it in 2005. Yet what made Fittipaldi's achievement even more remarkable was how completely he dominated the 1972 season in the Lotus 72. The car had been further refined and developed. It was given the designation 72D, and it was absolutely without peer on the grid. The 1972 season saw Lotus introduce a striking new livery that would become one of the most iconic in motorsport history. Gone was the red and cream of the gold leaf tobacco sponsorship. In came black and gold, the colors of John Player Special Cigarettes. The black and gold Lotus 72D became an instantly recognizable symbol of speed and innovation. Fittipaldi drove it to 5 victories across the 12-race season, an extraordinary strike rate. He won in Spain, Belgium, Britain, Austria, and Italy. His performances were characterized by a combination of smooth precision and occasional moments of hair-raising bravery. He seemed to instinctively understand the Lotus 72, exploiting its aerodynamic advantages and mechanical grip with a maturity that belied his relative inexperience. With Fittipaldi scoring virtually every point for the team, his teammate Dave Walker struggled to adapt to Formula One. Lotus secured their 3rd Constructors' Championship. The 72D was the class of the field. Rivals in McLaren and Ferrari had competitive machinery, but nothing could match the integrated package that was the Lotus 72. Fittipaldi's championship made him an international star. He became the figurehead of an emerging Brazilian presence in Formula One, opening the door for future generations of drivers from South America. The Lotus 72, in its 72D specification, had entered its golden age. The car would continue to improve, but this 1972 season represented its peak dominance, a moment when technical excellence, mechanical reliability, and driver talent aligned perfectly. After Fittipaldi's departure to McLaren at the end of 1972, one might have expected the Lotus 72's competitive window to close. But Colin Chapman had other ideas. In 1973, he brought in Swedish driver Ronnie Peterson, a brilliant but sometimes unpredictable talent who would prove to be almost perfectly suited to the Lotus 72's particular characteristics. Peterson was a smooth stylist who seemed to have an almost telepathic understanding with the car. He could exploit its aerodynamic advantages with a delicate touch while still being aggressive enough to capitalize on its mechanical grip. The 1973 season saw Lotus introduce the 72E specification with further refinements to suspension, aerodynamics, and structural safety elements that were being mandated by increasingly strict FIA regulations. Peterson scored 4 victories that year, with Fittipaldi, now at McLaren, securing 3 more, giving Lotus another Constructors' Championship, their 3rd with the 72. The Drivers' Championship slipped away to Jackie Stewart in the Tyrrell, but Lotus remained competitive. Peterson finished 3rd in the drivers' standings, a respectable result for a driver in only his first full season with the team. 1974 proved challenging as the sport moved through regulatory changes and technological evolutions. Peterson scored 3 victories, but couldn't mount a serious title challenge. Lotus finished 4th in the Constructors' Championship. The Lotus 72, now in its F specification, was showing its age relative to newer designs, though it remained fundamentally sound. But Chapman wasn't the type to let a car coast into obsolescence. He was already working on revolutionary new concepts that would harness ground effect aerodynamics. In 1975, the Lotus 72 made its final campaign, now in the ultimate F specification. Peterson remained the team's lead driver, but even his talents couldn't overcome the reality that the design was approaching the end of its competitive life. By the end of the American Grand Prix that October, when Peterson finished outside the points, the legendary Lotus 72's frontline career had come to an end. But what a career it had been. Across 6 seasons, from 1970 through 1975, the car had competed in 149 Grand Prix races. It had scored 20 victories. It had won 2 Drivers' Championships and 3 Constructors' Championships. Few racing cars in any era have achieved such sustained excellence. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Lotus 72's 6-year career was its evolution through different specifications. Each iteration represented Chapman and his engineering team's response to changing regulations, new technologies, and lessons learned from racing. Understanding these evolutions reveals how a brilliant initial concept could be refined and improved without losing its essential character. The 72B and 72C specifications, introduced early in 1970, represented the suspension modifications we discussed, the removal of the problematic anti-dive and anti-squat systems. These changes were so fundamental that they transformed the car from a mechanical nightmare into a race-winning machine. The 72D, introduced for 1972, saw significant refinements. The rear wing was repositioned further back, generating more downforce. The oil tank was modified to meet new safety regulations. The overall aerodynamic package was optimized based on 2 full seasons of wind tunnel work and racing data. The car's paint scheme changed to the iconic black and gold, and this specification would become synonymous with the Lotus 72's greatest achievements. The 72E specification, introduced in 1973, reflected regulatory changes that mandated stronger cockpit structures and other safety improvements. The wheelbase was lengthened by 5 centimeters, the front track was widened, and cable-operated torsion bars were introduced that worked only under tension. These modifications were designed to address a problem that had developed: excessive rear weight bias, which prevented the front tires from reaching optimal operating temperature. The E was a more mature, more developed evolution of the original concept. Finally, the 72F specification represented the ultimate refinement of the design. By 1975, however, the regulatory and technical environment of Formula One had shifted so dramatically that even Chapman's genius couldn't keep the design competitive against newer concepts. The era of the wedge-shaped, side radiator, inboard brake design was giving way to the ground-effect generation of cars that Chapman himself would pioneer with the Lotus 78 and 79. 55 years after its debut, every single Formula One car on the grid shares the fundamental design DNA of the Lotus 72. Look at the side pods of a modern Ferrari, Mercedes, or Red Bull, and you're looking at a direct technological descendant of the radiator placement Chapman and Philippe pioneered in 1970. The wedge shape that seemed so revolutionary then has become so thoroughly normalized that we barely register it as remarkable. The aerodynamic elements mounted on a monocoque chassis, the inboard brakes, the positioning of the fuel and engine, these are no longer innovations. They are the language of Formula One design itself. Modern design gurus and engineers freely acknowledge the Lotus 72's influence. Adrian Newey, arguably the greatest F1 car designer of the past 30 years, famously stated that the Lotus 72 is the car he wishes he had designed. When Newey speaks of wishing he had created something, you can be certain that something is genuinely important. The Lotus 72 set the template not just for its immediate successors, but for the entire trajectory of single-seater racing car design. Every fundamental principle about how a modern racing car is arranged, the placement of the radiators, the use of a stressed monocoque chassis, the inboard brake systems, the integration of aerodynamics into the overall design, originated or was perfected in the Lotus 72. Beyond Formula One, the impact extended throughout motorsport. Indy cars, sports cars, and other racing categories adopted similar design principles. The Lotus 72 wasn't just a successful racing car, it was a revolutionary statement about how racing cars should be designed. It demonstrated that by reconceiving fundamental assumptions about placement and arrangement, dramatic improvements in performance and efficiency could be achieved. It proved that lightweight and intelligent design could compete with brute power and complexity. It validated Chapman's philosophy in the most conclusive way possible, by winning. The 70's success also came at a crucial moment for motorsport innovation. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a period of rapid technical change and experimentation. Some concepts would prove dead ends, others would become cornerstones of the sport. The Lotus 72's approach, Radical enough to be revolutionary, yet fundamentally sound enough to endure, proved to be on the winning side of history. It influenced not just immediate successors, but the entire evolutionary tree of racing car design. The Lotus 72 occupies a unique place in motorsport history. It is not the most powerful car ever built. It is not the fastest in absolute terms. It is not the most successful in terms of raw statistics. Other cars have won more races, more championships, but it is, arguably, the most important car ever designed. It fundamentally altered how racing cars are conceived, engineered, and built. It proved that innovation in arrangement and positioning could be just as important as innovation in raw power and performance. The story of the Lotus 72 is the story of engineering genius, Colin Chapman's visionary direction combined with Maurice Philippe's mechanical sophistication. It is a story of tragic loss. Jochen Rindt's posthumous championship remains a haunting reminder of motorsport's dangers. It is a story of triumph. Emerson Fittipaldi's youthful dominance, Ronnie Peterson's artistic brilliance. It is a story of sustained excellence, 6 years of competitive success through multiple iterations and regulatory changes, maintaining relevance and performance. But most fundamentally, it is a story about innovation and the courage to reimagine something completely. Chapman and Philippe didn't just improve on existing designs, they completely reconceived how a racing car could be arranged. They looked at the accepted wisdom of the era, radiators in the nose, engines and gearboxes as separate components, simple aerodynamic bolt-ons, and asked, what if we did it completely differently? The answer they found was the Lotus 72, and in asking that question and finding that answer, they didn't just create a successful racing car. They created the template that would define motorsport design for the next 50 years and beyond. That is why the Lotus 72 matters. That is why it endures. That is why it changed everything. Word count, 4,016 words.